911, where's your emergency?
Come up here to my daughter's house up on Cemetery Hill, and my own grandson is dead, and my daughter and her husband are in the bed, and I swear everywhere in there, and I'm not touching nothing.
Sir, how many people's deceased?
It looks like it's 3. I can't find the other 2. There's a 3-year-old and my 16-year-old. You know where they're at.
Timothy? You have any idea who could have done this?
No.
Have there been any, family issues? I mean, anything like that going on between any of them?
They were having some trouble on Gavin. Issues with as far as, his temperament and he's running around or running away. A lot had to do with that girl that he was running. She's a fruitcake.
Gavin. So I'm Detective Crawford. That's Detective Officer with the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office. First name's Adam. Okay, but we want to talk to you because obviously there are people hurt, dead at your house, and we want to talk to you about it.
I'm called police. I used to hang out with them all the time.
When Gavin's talking to the police, he never asks about the well-being or welfare of his family. He's trying to present himself as a nice kid, somebody who wants to help them in whatever way is possible, that he's going to be cooperative. And really what those are his superficial and somewhat elementary attempts at manipulating them.
When did Gavin get here?
A couple days ago.
Okay. So, a couple days ago being today's Sunday. What day was he up here? What day did he get here?
I don't know the exact date, but it was about 5 days, I think. Well, today would have been the 5th day.
How could that be? Mama was here. She just left Friday. How could he dip her for 5 days? Did Mama know he was up here?
No, she didn't.
I'm trying to understand. You said he's been there for 5 days. How can that be?
You want to know the truth?
I do want to know the truth.
I know. Sorry. I know that you don't like him. I know that, but he's the only person that's really helped me through stuff. And I know it makes me. I know it's stupid. Okay, I know it, but he's the only person that makes me feel like I'm not alone. Because you guys made me feel like I'm alone. He's the only person that made me feel like I was something.
As Rebecca becomes more emotional and starts to talk more directly to her father, what we learn is that she's a teenager who's struggling. She's lonely, she's depressed, and Rebecca is clinging to this relationship because in her mind and in her teenage perspective on the world, Gavin's it.
What's amazing is that something absolutely horrible has happened. People have been brutally murdered, and her takeaway is that it's all about her. You guys did not make me feel special. He made me feel special. And there we begin to see the Romeo and Juliet story start to come together.
I know the answer to this, and so do you. But did he open up and tell you what he did?
Yes.
Good. What did he tell you? Did he say he shot him?
Yes.
What would drive him to do this stuff? Is it because he loved you so much?
lives at the house with you?
My mom, my stepdad, my baby brother, and my younger brother.
Okay, what are all their names?
Gage is the youngest. Well, not the youngest, younger brother. James is the baby. Dan is the stepdad, and mom is the Lisa.
Okay.
All ISA. I can't pronounce how it's right.
We get introduced to Smith, and we find out a few things about him. Obviously, he has some sort of speech impediment, which in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean anything in terms of his intellectual or cognitive functioning, but can have significant repercussions in terms of his social life, in terms of how he was treated by fellow classmates.
And when he's asked about the people in his family, he talks about them in the third person. This is the baby, this is the stepfather, and this is the mother, as if he's talking about a story. Something outside his own family, there's no real attachment. There's just no emotion coming from this teenager.
Some of your family members are deceased. Okay. You know what that means? They're dead, right?
Yes, sir.
The detective is very clever. He says, some of your family members are dead. He doesn't say all. We never hear Smith say, who? Who's dead? Who's alive? He doesn't ask any of those questions, which is very odd. Not so odd if he knows the answer.
So what we're wanting is to get the truth from you about what happened at your house and how your family ended up dead, okay?
Dad, I don't know, but I know about the abuse.
Huh?
I said I didn't know about the season, but I know about the abuse. My stepdad used to abuse me all the time if I didn't do something he wanted. And so would my mom.
He's not answering the question at all. He's front-loading his answer with excuses to try to justify what he's done. So that right there shows calculated thinking. He's thinking to try to reduce his culpability, and that's very psychopathic.
My stepdad, Dan, has been trying to kill me the past 2 days. He cut me right there with a knife. And he's been just trying to kill me while he can.
Despite the fact that he knows his stepfather and mother and brothers have been dead for this period of time, he's saying that for the past 2 days, his stepfather's tried to kill him. He points to a place where he was sliced on his arm and there's no real wound there. Gavin is not worried about fact-checking. He's not worried about the credibility of what he's saying. Some of that we see in teenagers in general. They kind of engage in this magical thinking. But some of this is also consistent with what we see in psychopathic individuals who compulsively or pathologically lie.
Tell me about Daniel. What kind of guy was he?
He loved them boys. He loved racing. He was one of the nicest guys you'd ever meet. I loved him to death. Dan was supposed to have a heart transplant.
Okay.
So he was only limited to what he could do because he couldn't get around, didn't have much wind.
I wonder why Gavin would be so angry to hurt Dan recently.
Unless he come and asked them to go up there, see her, and they would have told him no. And it broke her heart. All the times that Gavin would run away. Nobody understood why, but it always come back to that girl.
Let's start with Gavin.
Well, he didn't really like going to class. He was very childlike, very immature. He was not a typical ninth grader in behavior-wise. He didn't seem to have a ton of friends. You know, that's the biggest thing with him. He lacked social skills.
What the teacher describes here is really cements the fact that Smith was marginalized. He didn't like going to school because I'm sure school was a difficult place. His speech impediment set him up to be the target of horrific bullying. So that, again, is fueling this anger. Now, this profile that's coming out of this picture begins to look like the profile of a school shooter. of someone who at some point is going to snap and want retribution against everyone for all the harm he feels he suffered.
Did you have any issues with her?
She just didn't do a lot of work. When she did do an assignment, it was always centered around a boy. I mean, from my observation of her, it seemed like she was all about, you know, whatever boy she was with at the time. Kind of obsessed.
The big thing that stands out to me is that she describes Walker as a boy-obsessed individual, and it seems like Walker's self-esteem, self-identity, and self-worth were very tied to a man's perception of her or whether or not she had a romantic partner.
Well, Gavin, what we're getting at is we talked to Rebecca, and you told Rebecca that she killed your family, okay?
I don't regret it.
You regret it?
No.
Who'd you shoot first?
Dan.
Okay. Where'd you shoot Dan?
In the head. I smacked him on the head. Blonde Dan was in bed when I shot them.
Where was everybody else when you shot him?
Gage is, if I shot Gage, he went into the room and I shot him right down. And I had to kill Jay because Gage slit his throat right here.
Gage slit his throat? Why did Gage slit James?
Because he kept on screaming. James kept on screaming, he won't calm down. And Gage couldn't take it, and he put a knife to James and tried to slit it, and I shot Gage right there.
Okay. Well, why'd you shoot James?
I can't really do it, but I didn't like seeing him in pain. I was out his crib when I shot him.
When Smith talks about how he killed his entire family, he does it as though he was describing what he had for breakfast. It's completely devoid of any of the associated emotions that you would expect.
And when we think about psychopathic individuals, oftentimes there's a lack of remorse, there's a lack of guilt, there's a willingness to just blame others, to stay superficial in their emotions and their attachment.
Well, Gavin, I don't think Gage cut Jameson's throat. I think you did.
I might have messed up though. I'm not thinking straight. Gage didn't have to change, so I'm sorry.
Well, why did you tell us that to begin with?
I got messed up.
It's that Gavin Smith just kind of rolls over and he flip-flops on his story and pretty immediately says, I got mixed up. I was the one that did all of this. There was nothing that Gavin Smith got mixed up about. He was quite clear and focused, and so much so that he shot 3 of the family members in the head, point blank, and then went to his baby brother's room, slit his throat, and then shot him in the head.
Did you tell anybody about what you were planning to do?
When I told Rebecca, I told her I was going to kill them.
How long from when he showed up to when he actually told you what went down?
Well, he didn't tell me, like, when he got here. We was texting and all that, and we was FaceTiming. I knew that he was doing it. He had his gun in his hand.
And did he tell you why he was going to kill all of them? His reason?
His parents didn't like me for whatever reason. He wanted to just get rid of them so he could be with me.
This clip is incredibly disturbing in terms of showing us a glimpse of Rebecca Walker's mindset. She saw his hand on the gun as this was happening and yet did nothing to intervene. So White Why would that be? Is she so frightened? Didn't seem that way. Could she have gone to the police? Of course. Could she have told her grandmother? Absolutely. But she tells you why at the end of the clip. Because she wanted him to be with her. And what greater power there is than to know that someone kills for you. So clearly, now Romeo and Juliet have become Bonnie and Clyde.
At any point, do you recall ever encouraging Gavin to hurt his family? Did you ever tell him to just blatantly say, Gavin, I want you to hurt or kill your family?
I did encourage it, yes, I did.
Was that in regard to specifically his stepdad and mom or everyone, or what did you mean when you said that?
Everyone.
And by everyone, you mean?
His whole family. I was saying to hurry up. That's what I was saying.
Why were you telling him to do that?
Because I wanted me and him to spend time together.
She not only knew about it, but she encouraged him to kill every member of his family. So we get a very, very disturbing picture of a young woman who feels that it's so important for her to be loved that she's willing to be complicit in multiple murders in order to prove that. Maybe she even kind of weaponized him. Maybe she was able to push him over the edge to do what she needed for her own self-esteem. He had nothing left, and yet she had all of him, and that's all she wanted. And that kind of thought process can only be described as psychopathic.
Last night you explained that you guys were basically, talking about killing his family for a whole entire week. So what started at the beginning of that week to make him start talking about that, or you start suggesting?
I have no idea. Other than him telling me that he was tired of his family keeping us from being together and he wanted to hurt them. He was tired of the abuse he was going through and he wanted to be with me. And that's why he wanted to do it.
What's really important to realize here is in Walker's own interrogation, she's not showing any emotions. She's not showing any concern for all these people that have lost their lives senselessly.
If the two really wanted to be together, they could have run off together. No one had to die for the two of them to be together. So the motivation was not that his family needed to die for them to be together. The motivation was his family had to die for her to be happy. And that's really chilling. And that really paints a picture of Rebecca Walker as the bigger psychopath of the two.
The jury showed graphic and disturbing photos from inside the family's home. Smith occasionally glanced up at the photos, but showed no emotions as they were on display.
You murdered your entire family in cold blood, Mr. Smith. I find that you have zero remorse for your actions. Your actions can only be described as an act of pure evil.
Where's your emergency? I've been getting calls from my mother-in-law. My wife's not picking up the phone. What's her name? Jackie Wallace. I called her a bunch of times.
Okay, when's the last time you seen her?
Well, We got out of the lawyer today. We're going through a divorce, and I don't know if she's just not in. Okay, well, if she had at home, I think. I mean, this ain't like to go this long without following in.
When was the last time you saw her?
We went to lunch, and then we went to the lawyer at 3.
Tell me what time she actually left here.
I don't know. We got in an argument over this bankruptcy. It wasn't bad.
Okay. Did she say where she was going?
She took off walking.
Okay.
I've never seen her after that. Her car was gone.
Y'all got any kids together?
Yeah, I got triplets. 2 girls and a boy. Her parents are not right.
Did they talk to you?
Oh my God, trust me.
Okay.
Threaten me, all kinds of stuff.
Okay. You know the address there?
No, sir.
Okay.
Despite being law enforcement himself previously, Clay Waller didn't bother to call dispatch until he receives pressure from Jackie's family. Waller's lack of concern or urgency for locating his estranged wife, the mother of his triplets, who are only 5 years old, just makes his overall behavior suspicious.
So she left off on foot. Did you go try to look for her in your car then?
Yeah, I went down the hill. I didn't see her, and I went and got a soda to cool off.
My dad's a shady person. He always has been. I know he's going bankrupt. I know she was supporting him. If something bad happened, I think my dad did it. That's what I came in here to tell you guys.
Who's your dad's best friend?
My dad don't have no friends.
You've got to have somebody.
He has nobody.
What his son is starting to paint for us is a picture of somebody with a parasitic lifestyle mix where you're using other people. You're willing to live off of other people, and there's no real sense of adult responsibility or conscience to take care of yourself, to have a sense of integrity.
39-year-old Jackie Waller, formerly of Cape Girardeau, was last seen here on Woodland Drive in North Neal in Jackson.
Dozens of officers are now working this case. No one believes that this mother of 3 would just walk away from her children.
Wednesday, March 23rd, Clay called me at 7 a.m. He was threatening me and yelling at me. Met him at the airport. He told me that divorcing him was a death sentence. He would get me, and if he couldn't get to me, he would kill our kids. So, you know, in this excerpt, you can see that there's just no regard for his having any real genuine affection for his own children. And just like all the characters in a psychopath's life, they're not other people who have feelings and interests and the ability to feel pain or anything else. They're simply characters in the story as they relate to the psychopath. And it's striking that even his young children that he later claims he cares so much about actually appear as just pawns for him to use as suits him in a particular situation.
When we look at journal entries like this, I think what this speaks to is a pattern of coercive, emotional abuse, physical threats, and he is doing what so many domestic abusers do. When they can't get to their partner, they use the children as a weapon, and they threaten to harm the children.
A new development in the Jackie Waller case. Investigators searching her estranged husband's rental have discovered blood spatter on 2 walls and that carpet had been removed.
media's doing quite a number on me. We need to hear from you is what we need to do. We need your cooperation. I'm going to tell the story after it's all said and done. I'll tell it. What story? But until then, I'm just going to... What story? I'm going to just gonna keep my mouth shut. I don't have nothing to do with it. I haven't done anything.
Okay. Explain the carpet, Clay. Explain Jackie's blood on the walls. Explain that to me right now. Hello? Clay.
Clay Waller says the community's out to get him. People spray painting killer on his truck.
I mean, it's been a hard time for us all.
Carpet and carpet pad hidden out of view in the back of a crawl space. One piece had a large blood stain that the crime lab confirmed contained Jackie Waller's DNA.
Clay, do you have any comment? He was arrested in Malden, Missouri on charges not related to his estranged wife's disappearance. He now faced a charge of stealing from a Cape Girardeau company and also a harassment charge.
I'm not in here trying to trick you. I'm not in here trying to play games. I'm trying to talk to you man to man. I think something happened there. I can't tell you. I don't know where she's at.
They haven't yet found enough evidence to actually charge him with anything. And in his mind, as former law enforcement, without a body, what are they going to charge him with? So he just continues to taunt them. It's quite possible that this cat and mouse game isn't just Clay's hope to keep himself out of trouble. There's a secondary euphoria he's getting by thinking he's in charge. He's smarter than them.
I think his body language is telling. He's almost like stretched out, owning the entire interrogation room. He wants to show, I'm in control. You may think this is your interrogation, but really, I'm the one who's deciding which way we go.
I'm scared bloody no. It wasn't anything more than that. That doesn't make sense. That happened. It happened. Because you have blood in the hall on the walls. How's that going to happen? That don't make any sense either, Clay. I don't know.
When he's confronted about the biological evidence, he doesn't even miss a beat. He doesn't hesitate to just insert another lie. If she had a nosebleed, if she tripped and hurt herself, why would you cut out the carpet in a rental? And then on top of that, he very covertly hid it so that it would be out of line of sight for anybody if they came through the house. Every step of the way, he has done what he can to hide and obstruct the process. His need for power and control and his narcissistic views of things far supersede any fear response he may have. And that's something we do see oftentimes in psychopathic individuals.
Cutting the carpet out? Yeah, it was kind of a big deal. The cop said I can clean up the house. You can clean up, but that's not cleaning up. That's hiding something. I didn't do that. Then why not let me take the call? Does it clear me after that? If you can't make that promise, why does it have to be a promise? Is it about you or is it about Jack? Is it about you or is it about your kids? Is it about you? Is it only about you? Don't get upset. We can get the conversation. You ought to be happy that I get upset. My main concern is for Jack. Well, go find her. That's what I'm trying to do right here, buddy. I don't know where she's at. And you're never going to get it out of me. Never going to get it out of me. That would never be the answer. Why are you lying to me? I'm not. Yeah, you are. You are. You know you are, and I know you are. If you guys know so much, figure it out. I don't know what to tell you. I have nothing to do with nothing. You think you're really a lot smarter than you are.
Right at the end of the tunnel's going out for you. We're coming for you. And we're
our best. We don't need a body.
I don't give a like sit in jail.
I'll lock you up the rest of your life. What we're gonna do to you? Great. Huh? Great. Yeah, you narcissistic bastard. That's why you think about yourself.
On Thursday morning, Clay Waller appeared in court regarding the alleged death threats he made to Jackie Waller's sister, Cheryl Brinicki, on the website Topics.
Jackie's sister got custody of the children, the triplets. So I think that what this represents is that Jackie's sister has basically become a proxy for Jackie. The narcissistic traits in psychopaths, you know, if they experience kind of anything that threatens their feeling of mastery, it's going to trigger anger, and they're prone to lash out with violence, with threats, things like that. This specific dynamic of someone is going to take the children away from me, that sets him off, and he directs thoughts of violence toward that person. So for the longest time, it was Jackie. Jackie's out of the picture. This is a very kind of clear substitute.
Clay Waller has not been charged in connection with his wife's disappearance.
She's still missing, and our first and foremost priority is to find her.
Waller's parents just want their daughter found, especially for the sake of her 3 children, who turn 6 next month.
It's gone on so long. We want there to be an end to it, because it's so hard not to know.
He's doing things to enjoy that arousal of being in charge. And particularly with somebody who's a domestic violence perpetrator, that need for control is far more intense than it is for most of us. And so it's important to realize that at this point, because we know after the fact that Clay has killed Jackie, he's hidden her body, nobody knows where it is, he's got to get that thrill-seeking, that arousal from somewhere. So continuing to jerk the police around is how he does that.
Waller pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, a lesser charge.
You'd be remanded to the custody of the Missouri Department of Corrections to serve a term of 20 years of imprisonment.
Clay Waller led investigators here to Devil's Island in Alexander County, Illinois, where they dug up Jackie Waller's remains.
In return, Mr. Waller had to provide the location of Jackie Waller's body, sit down, and give an accounting of how he killed Jackie Waller.
I was very calm. And I said, if you take those kids from me, Jack, I'm going to kill you. And I'm just going to rest my life in jail, just like that. My wife came to me in December. She said, I want a divorce. At that point in time, I wasn't concerned about her. Because I knew ultimately if she got those kids to where they were away from me, it was over. I knew it was over. And then she came in about May 1st and she said, I want to go and get a divorce. I said, okay. I knew he was going to die as soon as you did it.
So June 1st, you had your discussion with your attorney.
Her attorney. We get outside and she's like, you want to have one last bang before we make this final. I'm like, yeah, it's going to be a bang over there.
Alright. So then what happened?
And she went to the refrigerator. I shot in there to get a Reese's peanut butter cup. I raised up and I hit her nose. She started bleeding. And she took off running. And she tripped. And she she tripped me. And, she made off the cuff remark. She said, I need to go tell the attorney that you just beat me up. I'm like, beat you up? I hit her in the face. I stood over and I punched her right in the nose. She started bleeding profusely. And then she was starting to thrash around. She just like, this hurts, and then blah, blah, blah. So I just took my forearm, just pressed into her neck, and she stopped moving.
Essentially, he states that it was Jackie's fault that she was killed. He said, I warned her, as if a threat that he acted on to kill her is in any way valid. But on top of that, he explains how he looked her in the eye as he was killing her, and he just didn't feel anything bad because he warned her, and so he's absolved of any type of guilt or responsibility.
She was too heavy to move. So then I went, there was a trash can sitting right here, and I load her in that trash can. And then I take it out, and I take it over here.
Okay, so you put the can containing Jackie in the back of your truck?
Yeah.
He had just committed murder, and his wife is now dead. The children that he has with her are now motherless, and he's complaining about her body being too heavy. Even then, he's saying it in such a way that the only real emotion he shows is for himself.
I got the boat out, which was difficult because there was mud and water was not very deep.
Okay, and you go up the river? It's on the Illinois side, just south of Devil's Island Chute.
Yeah.
What day did you dig the hole that you buried her in?
The day before.
The day before? So May 31st?
Very gently pulled her out, placed her in the hole, and I told her all I wanted was my family. Or something along those lines. That's what I told her.
While Waller is describing the details of what actually happened the day he killed Jackie, there are moments where he sounds like it was this impulsive act, but he dug the hole before. He knew she signed her death warrant the minute she didn't back down on the divorce. There's a complete disconnect from the terror and coercive behavior that he engaged in throughout their relationship. Perpetrators of domestic violence have a very distorted view of their role in the relationship, how they behave, the motivations behind the violence and aggression, who's to blame, as well as a belief, perhaps, that these are actions of love. Jackie wanted to leave and provide her children a better life. That was her riskiest point of safety, and she didn't make it.
In May of 2016, Clay Waller was charged with interstate domestic violence, meaning Waller traveled back and forth between Illinois and Missouri with the intent to kill his wife. Jackie Waller's sister delivered the victim's impact statement. Cheryl Brinicki now raising, along with her husband, Clay and Jackie Waller's 7-year-old triplets.
They know you murdered their mother. We had to tell them that.
Clay Waller's son, Maddox, also had a taped recording for his dad.
I thought you were a good guy. Now I know you're not. You big, fat jerk, you. I never want to see you again for my entire life. This is the last time you'll hear of me.
My pretty white shoelaces I just washed were on the bed rail. Grabbed one with one hand and I tied it around her throat.
So what's intellectually going through your mind?
If I'm going to become a serial killer, and that'll be the end of it.
There are crimes in American history that remain unsolved for years because investigators cannot identify the person responsible. There are others in which the evidence is lost, witnesses disappear, and the truth becomes increasingly difficult to reconstruct as time passes. The assassination of Medgar Wiley Evers was different. In this case, the man eventually convicted of the killing was identified remarkably quickly. Investigators recovered the rifle used in the attack. A fingerprint on that weapon was connected to Byron DeLa Beckwith. Beckwith was arrested only days after Evers was murdered. Yet the story did not end there. It would take more than 3 decades before the American justice system finally produced a conviction. On June 12, 1963, Medgar Evers was shot outside his own home in Jackson, Mississippi. He was 37 years old. He was a husband, a father, and one of the most prominent civil rights activists working in Mississippi. His work with the NAACP had placed him directly in the struggle against racial segregation. He helped organize voter registration efforts, supported boycotts, investigated racial violence, and worked toward the integration of schools. In a state where the existing racial order was defended with extraordinary determination. That work made Evers a highly visible target. His family had already received threats, and by 1963, Evers understood that the work he was doing could put his life in danger. But understanding danger and knowing exactly when it will arrive are two different things. On the night of June 11, 1963, the country was witnessing an important moment in the history of the civil rights movement. President John F. Kennedy delivered a nationally televised address concerning civil rights. Medgar Evers called his wife, Merle, and encouraged her to watch the speech. He could not remain at home himself because he still had NAACP responsibilities to attend to. Merle stayed with their children and watched the broadcast. Somewhere else in Jackson, Evers was completing the work that had become such a central part of his life. Later that night, close to midnight, he returned home. He stepped from his vehicle and began walking toward his house. He was carrying shirts bearing the words, "Jim Crow must go." It was an ordinary act in one sense, a man returning home after work, approaching the place where his wife and children were waiting. But outside that house, hidden at a distance of roughly 200 feet, someone was waiting for him. The shooter had positioned himself near vegetation across from the Evers residence. From there, the rifle was aimed toward the house. Evers had no opportunity to confront the person watching him. As he moved toward the door, a single shot was fired. The bullet struck him in the back. The force of the wound brought him down near his home. In the space of a moment, the house that had been a place of family life became the scene of a murder. Merle heard the gunshot. Her children reacted by seeking safety inside the house, according to what they had been taught to do in dangerous circumstances. Merle went outside and found her husband seriously wounded. Neighbors soon appeared. Police were called. Evers was placed in a vehicle and taken to the hospital with police escort, but the wound was too severe. He died from blood loss and the effects of his injuries. He was only 37 years old. For his family, the loss was immediate and devastating. For Mississippi and for the broader civil rights movement, the assassination became something larger, the killing of a man who had spent years challenging racial discrimination and working for the rights of Black Americans. But the murder itself was only the beginning of a story that would stretch across generations. Almost immediately, investigators began examining the crime scene. The path of the bullet offered an important clue. After entering Evers's body, the projectile continued through the window, passed through a wall, struck the refrigerator, and eventually came to rest on the kitchen counter. By reconstructing this trajectory, investigators were able to establish the direction from which the shot had been fired. Their attention turned toward the area across from the house. Roughly 200 feet away, they discovered signs that someone had been concealed among the vegetation. A branch had been broken, and the surrounding plants showed signs of disturbance. Then they found the weapon. Hidden among vines was an Enfield .30-06 Model 1917 rifle. The weapon was not simply another object found near the scene. Investigators determined that it was connected to the shooting, and on its scope they found a fingerprint. That fingerprint would become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case. It provided investigators with something that many murder investigations never obtain: a direct physical link between a weapon and a potential suspect. The fingerprint was sent to the FBI, where it was compared against military fingerprint records. The result pointed to one man, Byron de la Beckwith. Beckwith was a white segregationist and a member of the White Citizens Council, an organization that supported maintaining racial segregation. Investigators also developed other evidence connecting him to the crime. There was evidence that Beckwith had investigated the location of Evers's home before the assassination. Witness information placed his vehicle in Jackson around the relevant period. Investigators also noted an injury around Beckwith's eye that was consistent with the recoil of the rifle's scope striking the shooter. The weapon, the fingerprint, the suspected motive, and the other evidence formed a picture that appeared remarkably clear. On June 23, 1963, Beckwith was arrested. At that moment, it might have seemed that the murder of Medgar Evers had been solved. The victim was known. The weapon had been recovered. A suspect had been identified through a fingerprint. The suspect had been arrested. Yet the apparent simplicity of the investigation would prove deceptive. The real story of the Evers assassination was not simply about finding the person accused of pulling the trigger. It was about what happened afterward, when the case entered a courtroom and the evidence encountered a system shaped by the society in which the murder had occurred. In 1964, Beckwith went to trial. Then he went to trial again. Both times, the juries were all white. Both times, the juries failed to reach a unanimous verdict. There was no conviction. The legal process had reached a dead end, and Beckwith was not sent to prison for the murder of Medgar Evers. The case that had seemed so straightforward at the beginning was suddenly unresolved. Evers was dead. His family was left without him. His name would become increasingly associated with the struggle for civil rights. But the man accused of killing him remained free, and that was how the case would remain for years. Medgar Evers' assassination, therefore, became a story with two timelines. The first was the timeline of the murder itself: the threats, the return home, the rifle shot, the investigation, the recovered weapon, the fingerprint, the arrest. The second was much longer. It stretched from 1963 into the 1990s. During those decades, Evers became a symbol of the civil rights movement, while the question of whether his killer would ever be held accountable remained unresolved. At the center of that second timeline stood Myrlie Evers, who did not allow the case to disappear. For decades, she continued to press for the murder to be reconsidered. Toward the end of the 1980s, renewed attention began to focus on the case. New information emerged, and witnesses who had previously been unwilling or unable to speak became part of the effort to reopen the investigation. In December 1990, a new grand jury indicted Beckwith. The man once arrested shortly after Evers' death was now facing the possibility of a new trial more. Then 27 years later, some witnesses reported that Beckwith had boasted that he had killed Evers. He was living in Tennessee at the time, and authorities had to bring him back to Mississippi. Then, in 1994, approximately 31 years after Medgar Evers was murdered, Byron de la Beckwith stood trial again. He was now around 70 years old. The rifle and the earlier evidence remained part of the story, but the courtroom was no longer the same as it had been in 1964. This time, the jury consisted of 8 black jurors and 4 white jurors. After approximately 2 weeks of proceedings, the jury reached its decision: guilty. Byron de la Beckwith was convicted of murdering Medgar Evers and sentenced to life imprisonment. The conviction did not change what had happened on that June night in 1963. It could not return a husband to his wife or a father to his children. It could not erase the years that had passed between the murder and the verdict. But after 31 years, the legal system had finally reached a conclusion. Beckwith had been identified shortly after the crime, yet justice had taken a generation to arrive. That is what makes the assassination of Medgar Evers so significant. It is not only a story about a fatal shot outside a Mississippi home. It is a story about a man who understood the danger of his work, but continued doing it. About a family forced to live with the consequences of his murder. About evidence that pointed toward a suspect almost immediately. And about a conviction delayed for more than 3 decades. Most importantly, it is the story of Medgar Evers himself. Before he became the victim of a historic assassination, he was a man committed to changing a society in which racial discrimination was deeply entrenched. He worked for voter registration, investigated violence, challenged segregation, and advocated for integration. His life was cut short at 37, but the work he had been doing did not disappear with him. His murder became part of the history of the American Civil Rights Movement, and his name endured long after the gunman had fled the scene. The case would eventually end with a conviction, but for 31 years the question remained hanging over the country. If the evidence could identify a suspect so soon, why did it take so long for justice to follow? Medgar Wiley Evers did not become a symbol of the American Civil Rights Movement because he sought fame. His importance came from the work he was willing to do in a place and at a time when challenging. Racial discrimination could make a person a target. In Mississippi, the struggle for equal rights was not an abstract political debate. It was a confrontation with a deeply established system of segregation, and those who attempted to challenge that system could face threats and violence. Evers understood that reality, yet he continued. Born in 1925, Evers later served in the United States military during World War II. His experience as a veteran became part of the life he built afterward. But it was his work with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, better known as the NAACP, that would define his public life. As the NAACP's field secretary in Mississippi, Evers became one of the organization's most visible representatives in the state. His responsibilities placed him directly in the middle of some of the most difficult issues facing Black Americans. One of those responsibilities was voter registration. For many Black Americans, participating fully in the political system was not simply a matter of filling out a form and appearing at the polls. The broader struggle over voting rights was connected to the system of racial discrimination that Evers was trying to challenge. His work, therefore, carried consequences far beyond any single registration effort. He was helping people claim a political voice in a society where racial inequality remained deeply entrenched. Evers also became involved in organizing boycotts. These efforts were another way of challenging discrimination through collective action. Rather than accepting the existing system as permanent, the work demanded that institutions and communities confront the consequences of segregation. Evers's position with the NAACP meant that he was not simply commenting on these problems from a distance. He was involved directly in organizing and investigating. He investigated cases of racial violence, bringing attention to incidents that might otherwise have remained ignored or forgotten. He also worked toward the integration of schools. Each of these activities placed him in opposition to people who wanted the racial order to remain unchanged. That opposition made Evers increasingly visible. The more active he became, the more he represented a challenge to those who defended segregation. His work was therefore dangerous not because he carried a weapon or sought confrontation, but because he continued to demand changes in a system that depended on inequality. By 1963, the danger surrounding him was no longer theoretical. His family had received threats. Evers understood that his work could put his life at risk. This knowledge forms an important part of the story because it changes the way we understand the months and days before his death. The assassination did not occur in a completely unexpected vacuum. There had already been hostility toward him and toward the work he represented. Yet knowing that danger exists does not mean knowing when it will become violence. A person can understand that threats are possible and still return home at night expecting to see the people he loves. That contradiction would become central to the tragedy of the Evers family. Medgar Evers was a husband and a father, as well as a civil rights activist. His public responsibilities existed alongside his private life. The same man who spent his days working on voter registration, boycotts, investigations of racial violence, and school integration would eventually return to a family home where his wife and children were waiting. The distinction between those two worlds would become impossible to maintain on the night of June 11, 1963. Before that night, however, Evers's work had already established him as a significant figure in Mississippi. The NAACP had entrusted him with a position that required him to confront racial discrimination directly. His efforts to promote voting rights meant encouraging black citizens to participate in a political system from which they had been systematically excluded. His involvement in boycotts demonstrated the power of organized resistance. His investigations into racial violence placed him in contact with some of the most painful realities of the era, and his support for school integration challenged one of the most visible structures of segregation. None of these activities existed separately. Together, they represented a demand for a society in which race would no longer determine a person's access to education, political participation, or equal treatment under the law. That demand was powerful, but it also made Evers a recognizable opponent of segregation. The threats directed at his family therefore carried a particular weight. They were not simply threats against an individual public figure. They entered the private space of his home. For Merle Evers, the danger surrounding her husband was something she and the children had to live with. By 1963, the possibility that Medgar might be harmed was part of the reality of their lives. But the family continued forward. Evers continued his work. This is important because the story of his assassination can easily become dominated by the circumstances of his death. Yet before the rifle, before the investigation, and before the courtroom, there was a man whose daily life consisted of repeated efforts to change his community. His murder was significant precisely because of the person who was lost. On June 11, 1963, that larger struggle entered a particularly tense moment. President John F. Kennedy delivered a televised speech concerning civil rights. Evers spoke with Merle and encouraged her to watch the address. The conversation was brief in the information available, but its meaning becomes clearer when viewed against the background of Evers's life. Civil rights was not an issue he observed from the outside. It was the work that occupied his days and influenced the safety of his family. Yet he could not remain home to watch the speech with Merle and the children. His NAACP responsibilities required him elsewhere. While his family watched the president's address, Evers continued carrying out his responsibilities. It was one more example of the two worlds he inhabited, the national struggle for civil rights and the private life of a family trying to live normally in the middle of that struggle. Later that night, Evers returned to Jackson, Mississippi. He was coming home from his NAACP activities. The hour was approaching midnight. He stepped from his vehicle carrying shirts marked with the words, "Jim Crow must go." The message on those shirts captured the cause to which he had devoted himself. Jim Crow represented the system of racial segregation that Evers had spent his career challenging. The phrase was therefore more than a slogan. It represented the purpose behind his work, to dismantle the structures that treated Black Americans as unequal. As Evers approached his house, the world around him was quiet enough that he could not know what was waiting nearby. A shooter had positioned himself approximately 200 feet away, near vegetation across from the residence. Evers was approaching his own front door. His wife and children were inside. He had returned from another night of work. He was carrying the symbols of the movement he served. And somewhere in the darkness, the weapon that would kill him was already in position. The tragedy of the moment lies partly in how ordinary the final steps must have appeared. Evers was not entering a battlefield. He was coming home. But the threats that had followed him through his public life had reached the private space of his family. The work that had made him a civil rights leader had also made him vulnerable to those who opposed the changes he represented. He had understood that possibility. But understanding danger had not stopped him from continuing his work. That decision had defined his life. It would also define the meaning of his death. In the hours before the assassination, nothing about Evers's actions suggested that he had abandoned the cause. He had continued his responsibilities, spoken with his wife, and returned home. His life remained connected to the larger movement outside his front door. Then, as he approached the house, the distance between public struggle and private life disappeared. The man who had spent years working to register voters, organize boycotts, investigate racial violence, and promote school integration was about to become the victim of one of the most consequential assassinations of the civil rights era. What happened next would transform his family forever and send investigators searching for the person who had been waiting across the street. But before the evidence, the rifle, the fingerprint, the arrest, and the courtroom battles, there was this essential fact. Medgar Evers had spent his life challenging racial discrimination in Mississippi, even while knowing that the work could put his life in danger. On that June night, he came home from that work. He never made it safely through his front door. The next sound would be a gunshot, and the man who had dedicated himself to changing Mississippi would become the center of a murder investigation that would eventually span more than 3 decades. By the time Medgar Evers returned home, the night had already passed into the early hours of June 12, 1963. The events of the previous day had placed civil rights at the center of national attention. President John F. Kennedy had delivered a televised address concerning civil rights, and Evers had spoken with his wife, Merle, encouraging her to watch it. But while the country was witnessing a significant moment through television screens, Evers was still carrying out the responsibilities that had defined his life. He could not remain at home with his wife and children. His work with the NAACP required him elsewhere, and after completing his activities, he eventually made his way back to the family home in Jackson, Mississippi. It was close to midnight when he arrived. There was nothing unusual about a man returning home after work. For Evers, however, the simple act of coming home had always existed alongside an awareness of danger. His work as the NAACP's field secretary in Mississippi had placed him in direct opposition to racial discrimination. He had worked on voter registration, organized boycotts, investigated racial violence, and supported the integration of schools. His activities had made him a prominent figure in the struggle for civil rights, and his family had received threats. Evers knew that the work he was doing could put his life at risk, yet he continued doing it. On this particular night, he returned carrying shirts marked with the words, "Jim Crow must go." The words represented the cause that had occupied so much of his professional life. Jim Crow was the system of racial segregation that Evers had spent years challenging, and the message on the shirts expressed the goal of the movement in direct language. He stepped out of his vehicle and began moving toward the house. His wife and children were inside. The home represented the private side of his life, a place separate from the public meetings, investigations, organizing efforts, and political struggle that occupied his days. But that separation was about to disappear. Across from the Evers residence, approximately 200 feet away, a shooter had positioned himself near an area of vegetation. The distance was significant. The gunman was not standing directly outside the home or confronting Evers face-to-face. Instead, he had selected a position from which he could fire toward the residence while remaining concealed. Evers had no way of knowing that someone was waiting for him. He was approaching the entrance to his own home. Then the rifle was fired. The bullet struck him in the back. The impact caused him to fall near the house. In an instant, the journey home was transformed into a life-threatening emergency. There had been no confrontation described between Evers and the shooter. There was simply the movement toward the door, the shot from a concealed position, and the collapse of a 37-year-old man outside his home. Inside the house, Merle heard the gunshot. Her children reacted by seeking shelter inside, following what they had been taught to do when danger occurred. Merle went outside and found her husband seriously wounded. The scene was no longer the ordinary family home that had existed only moments earlier. It had become the location of a violent attack. Neighbors soon appeared, and police were called. Evers was placed in a vehicle and transported to the hospital with police escort. At that point, the family and those around them could only respond to the immediate emergency. The bullet had caused injuries so severe that medical treatment could not save him. Evers died from blood loss and the effects of the wound. He was 37 years old. The death of Medgar Evers was therefore not only the loss of a civil rights leader. It was the sudden destruction of a family. Merle had gone from waiting for her husband to return home to finding him critically wounded outside their house. His children had gone from watching television and waiting for their father to return to sheltering themselves from danger. In the space of one night, the consequences of the struggle Evers had faced publicly entered the most private part of his life. His assassination also sent a powerful message beyond the walls of the Evers home. He had been one of the most active representatives of the NAACP in Mississippi. He had worked to register black voters, to challenge segregation, to investigate racial violence, and to support school integration. His work had made him a visible opponent of the racial order he was trying to change. Now he had been killed outside his own home. The question that followed was immediate and fundamental. Who had fired the shot? The answer would not remain unknown for long. The physical evidence left behind at the scene would provide investigators with a remarkable trail. The path taken by the bullet became one of the first important clues. After striking Evers, the projectile continued through the window of the house. It passed through a wall, then struck the refrigerator, and eventually came to rest on the kitchen counter. This unusual trajectory allowed investigators to determine the direction from which the shot had been fired. The bullet had effectively left a path through the home that could be studied after the attack. Investigators followed that path outward, approximately 200 feet away. In the area where the shooter was believed to have been positioned, they found signs of disturbance among the vegetation. A branch had been broken. The surrounding plants had been disturbed. These details suggested that someone had occupied the concealed position. As the investigation continued, investigators discovered a rifle hidden among vines. It was an Enfield .30-06 model 1917. The discovery changed the nature of the investigation. The weapon was not simply evidence that a firearm had been present. It could potentially provide investigators with a direct connection to the person who had fired the fatal shot. And on the scope of that rifle, investigators found a fingerprint. That fingerprint would become one of the defining pieces of evidence in the case. The investigation was now moving from the victim and the crime scene toward the identity of the person responsible. The rifle offered a physical object that could be examined. The fingerprint offered the possibility of identifying the person who had handled it. And the location of the weapon, combined with the reconstruction of the bullet's trajectory, connected the rifle to the position from which the shot had been fired. For the investigators, the sequence was becoming clearer. Evers had been shot as he approached his home. The bullet's path indicated a firing position approximately 200 feet away. Vegetation in that area showed signs of disturbance, and a rifle had been hidden there. On that rifle was a fingerprint. The next step would be to determine whose fingerprint it was. The weapon was sent into the investigative process, and the fingerprint was submitted to the FBI for comparison with military fingerprint records. What followed would make the Evers case different from many murders in which the identity of the killer remains unknown for years. The fingerprint led investigators to a name, Byron de la Beckwith. Beckwith was a white segregationist and a member of the White Citizens Council, an organization that supported maintaining racial segregation. Investigators also developed other information connecting him to the assassination. There was evidence that Beckwith had investigated the location of Evers's home before the killing. Witness information placed his vehicle in Jackson around the relevant period. Investigators also noted an injury around his eye that was consistent with the recoil of the rifles. Scope striking the shooter. Each piece of evidence added another element to the emerging case. The rifle connected the crime to a physical object. The fingerprint connected that object to Beckwith. His background provided a potential motive consistent with opposition to Evers's civil rights work. Evidence suggested that he had taken an interest in the location of Evers's residence. His vehicle was placed in Jackson around the relevant period, and the injury around his eye was consistent with the weapon's recoil. The investigation that had begun with a gunshot outside a family home was now focused on a specific individual. On June 23, 1963, Byron DeLaw Beckwith was arrested. At first glance, the case appeared to have moved rapidly from murder to identification to arrest. The man investigators believed was responsible had been located. The rifle had been recovered. The fingerprint had produced a name, yet the arrest would not bring the story to its conclusion. It would only begin the next and perhaps most difficult stage of the case. The evidence would have to enter a courtroom. There, the question would no longer be simply who investigators believed had killed Medgar Evers. The question would be whether the legal system could turn the evidence gathered at the scene into a conviction. That question would remain unanswered for much longer than anyone could have expected. The murder had occurred in June 1963. The suspect had been arrested before the month was over. But the final verdict would not come in 1963 or 1964 or even during the following decade. It would take 31 years. For Merle Evers and her children, the arrest could not undo what had happened outside their home. For the civil rights movement, the death of Medgar Evers became another devastating example of the danger faced by those who challenged segregation. And for investigators, the case now rested on a collection of evidence that appeared to point toward one man. The next battle would take place in court. In 1964, Byron DeLaw Beckwith would face trial. Then he would face trial again. And both times, despite the evidence gathered after the shooting, the courtroom would fail to produce a unanimous verdict. Once Medgar Evers had been taken from the scene and his death confirmed, the nature of the night changed completely. The immediate emergency was over, but the investigation had only begun. Evers was dead, his family was left behind, and somewhere beyond the house was the physical evidence that could reveal how the shooting had happened. The investigators now had to reconstruct a crime that had lasted only moments. There had been a single fatal shot. The shooter had not confronted Evers directly. Instead, he had apparently remained concealed at a considerable distance from the house. The first task was therefore to determine where that shot had originated. The answer was contained partly in the path of the bullet. The projectile had not simply disappeared into the darkness after striking Evers. It continued through the scene, leaving behind a trail that investigators could follow. After passing through Evers's body, the bullet traveled through a window of the house. It then passed through a wall before striking the refrigerator. From there, it eventually came to rest on the kitchen counter. To investigators, this sequence mattered. A bullet's path can establish direction. And in this case, the trajectory pointed away from the house toward the area from which the shot had been fired. The investigators followed that direction. Their attention moved across the roughly 200 feet, separating the Evers residence from the location where the shooter had apparently taken position. The distance itself suggested that this had not been an impulsive confrontation at close range. Someone had selected a position away from the house and used the surrounding vegetation as concealment. When investigators examined the area, they found signs that supported that conclusion. A branch had been broken. The vegetation around it had been disturbed. These were small physical details, but in a murder investigation, small details can become significant when they correspond with other evidence. The disturbed vegetation was located in the area indicated by the trajectory of the bullet. It suggested that someone had occupied the position, and the investigators continued searching. Then they found the rifle. It had been hidden among vines. The weapon was an Enfield .30-06 model 1917. Its discovery provided investigators with something far more tangible than an estimate of where the shooter had been standing. They now had a firearm that could potentially be connected directly to the fatal shot. The rifle was examined, and another crucial piece of evidence was found. There was a fingerprint on the scope. That fingerprint would eventually lead investigators to Byron DeLa Beckwith. But before the name emerged, the importance of the fingerprint was already clear. The weapon had been concealed near the location indicated by the bullet's trajectory. It was the type of object that could have been used in the shooting, and it carried a fingerprint that could potentially identify the person who had handled it. The investigators sent the fingerprint to the FBI. The Bureau compared it with military fingerprint records. The comparison produced a result: Byron DeLa Beckwith. With that identification, the investigation moved from an unknown gunman to a named suspect. But the fingerprint was not the only piece of evidence connecting Beckwith to the killing. Investigators also learned that Beckwith was a white segregationist and a member of the White Citizens Council, an organization that supported maintaining racial segregation. This background was significant because of the nature of Evers's work. Evers had devoted himself to challenging racial discrimination in Mississippi. He worked with the NAACP as its field secretary in the state. His responsibilities included voter registration, boycotts, investigations into racial violence, and efforts towards school integration. His work had made him an opponent of the system Beckwith supported. The investigation, therefore, contained not only physical evidence but also a possible motive, consistent with the conflict at the heart of Evers's public life. Investigators also had evidence that Beckwith had investigated the location of Evers's home before the assassination. That detail was important because it potentially connected him not merely to the political environment surrounding Evers but to the specific location where the killing occurred. The question was no longer simply whether Beckwith opposed the work Evers was doing. The investigation was examining whether Beckwith had taken steps to learn where Evers lived before the fatal attack. Witness information provided another connection. Some witnesses placed Beckwith's vehicle in Jackson around the relevant period. The information did not stand alone. It existed alongside the fingerprint, the rifle, and the other evidence being assembled by investigators. There was also the matter of Beckwith's eye. Investigators observed an injury around his eye that was consistent with the recoil of the rifle's scope striking the person who fired it. Again, the significance of this detail depended on its relationship to the other evidence. A rifle had been recovered from a concealed position. The weapon had a scope. A fingerprint on that scope had been linked to Beckwith, and Beckwith had an injury around his eye consistent with the recoil of that same type of weapon. Piece by piece, the investigation was building a case. None of these details existed in isolation. The rifle established a physical connection to the location of the shooting. The fingerprint pointed toward a particular individual. Beckwith's segregationist beliefs and membership in the White Citizens Council provided a possible motive connected to Evers's civil rights activities. Evidence that he had investigated the location of Evers's home suggested prior interest in the victim's residence. Witness information placed his vehicle in Jackson around the relevant period. His eye injury was consistent with the rifle's recoil. The investigators were no longer searching for a person without a name. They were investigating Byron DeLa Beckwith. On June 23, 1963, Beckwith was arrested. The arrest came only days after Evers's assassination. From the perspective of the investigation itself, the sequence was strikingly direct. A man had been killed outside his home. Investigators reconstructed the trajectory of the fatal shot. They identified a concealed position approximately 200 feet away. They found a rifle hidden among vines. A fingerprint was recovered from the scope. The fingerprint was compared with military records. The comparison identified Beckwith. Additional evidence connected him to Evers and to the circumstances surrounding the shooting. Then came the arrest. At that moment, it would have been reasonable to believe that the central mystery had been solved. But identifying and arresting a suspect is not the same as proving guilt in court. The investigation had produced evidence, but the legal system would now have to examine that evidence through a trial. The next stage would be far less straightforward. In 1964, Beckwith would be prosecuted for the murder of Medgar Evers. The evidence gathered during the investigation would become part of the courtroom battle. The fingerprint, the rifle, the circumstances surrounding the weapon, The evidence concerning Beckwith's connection to Evers's home, his presence in Jackson, and the other details would all take on a new significance. The investigators had followed the physical trail from the body to the bullet, from the bullet to the firing position, from the firing position to the hidden rifle, and from the rifle to the fingerprint. That trail had led them to one man. But the courtroom would ask a different question. Was the evidence sufficient to produce a unanimous verdict? The answer in 1964 would be no. Beckwith would be tried twice that year. Both juries would be all white, and neither would reach a unanimous decision. The result was a hung jury rather than a conviction. The investigation had succeeded in identifying Beckwith and bringing him before the court. But the prosecution did not end with a guilty verdict. The man arrested after the assassination remained free. For the Evers family, the result meant that the loss of Medgar had not been followed by the legal resolution they might have expected. For Merle Evers, the woman who had heard the gunshot and found her husband wounded outside their home, the case remained unfinished. The evidence that had led investigators to Beckwith did not disappear simply because the first trials failed. The rifle remained part of the story. The fingerprint remained part of the story. The investigation remained part of the record. And the question of who would ultimately be held responsible remained open. This was the point at which the Evers case entered its most unusual phase. The initial investigation had been measured in days. The arrest had come before the month of June was over. Yet the legal conclusion would take decades. The evidence had pointed toward Beckwith in 1963, but the courts did not produce a conviction in 1964. The case would therefore move into a period of silence and uncertainty. For years, the man accused of killing Medgar Evers would remain outside prison. Meanwhile, Evers's name would continue to represent the civil rights struggle he had dedicated his life to. His family would continue living with the consequences of his death. And Merle Evers would continue to believe that the case should not simply be allowed to disappear. The investigation had found a trail. It had followed that trail to a suspect. What remained was whether that trail could eventually lead to justice. More than 3 decades would pass before the answer finally came. By the time Byron DeLa Beckwith entered the courtroom in 1964, the murder of Medgar Evers was no longer simply a crime scene investigation. The rifle had been found. The fingerprint on its scope had been traced through military records to Beckwith. Investigators had gathered additional information connecting him to the location of Evers's home and to Jackson around the time of the assassination. There was also evidence concerning Beckwith's segregationist beliefs, his membership in the White Citizens Council, and an injury around his eye that was consistent with the recoil of the rifle's scope. On June 23, 1963, he had been arrested. From the perspective of those who had followed the investigation, the case appeared to have a clear direction. But an arrest is not a conviction, and evidence that appears compelling during an investigation must still survive the demands of a courtroom. In 1964, Beckwith was tried for the murder of Medgar Evers. The first trial should have been the moment when the evidence gathered after the shooting was placed before a jury and transformed into a legal judgment. Instead, it became the beginning of a much longer struggle. The circumstances surrounding the trial were inseparable from the Mississippi in which it took place. Evers had been a prominent civil rights activist. He had worked with the NAACP to challenge racial discrimination, promote voter registration, organize boycotts, investigate racial violence, and support school integration. His work had directly challenged segregation. Beckwith, by contrast, was a white segregationist and a member of the White Citizens Council, an organization that supported maintaining racial segregation. The murder therefore existed within a deeply divided social and political environment. The courtroom was being asked to decide the fate of a man accused of killing one of the state's most visible civil rights activists. The evidence from the investigation remained central to the prosecution's case. The rifle was a physical object recovered near the location from which the fatal shot had apparently been fired. Its scope carried a fingerprint connected to Beckwith. The bullet's trajectory had helped investigators identify the direction of the shot and the approximate location of the shooter. The disturbed vegetation and broken branch provided additional details about the concealed position. Investigators had also gathered information concerning Beckwith's connection to Evers's residence and his presence in Jackson around the relevant period. The injury around Beckwith's eye provided another detail that investigators considered consistent with the recoil of the rifle. Taken together, these elements had led authorities to arrest him only days after the assassination. Yet the courtroom did not simply reproduce the investigation. A jury had to consider the evidence and reach a unanimous verdict. That requirement would become decisive. The jury in the first trial was all white. When the proceedings ended, the jurors could not reach the unanimous decision necessary for a conviction. The result was a hung jury. There was no guilty verdict. Beckwith was not convicted of killing Medgar Evers. For the Evers family, this meant that the death outside their home had not been followed by a legal conclusion. Medgar was still gone. The person accused of killing him was still not imprisoned for the crime. The case had moved through the investigative stage and into the courtroom, but the courtroom had not produced the result that prosecutors sought. The state did not simply abandon the case. Beckwith was tried again in 1964. The second trial again placed the murder before a jury. Again, the evidence connecting Beckwith to the crime became part of the legal proceedings. Again, however, the jury was all white. And again, the jurors failed to reach a unanimous verdict. The second trial therefore ended in another hung jury. 2 trials, 2 all-white juries. Nokembikchen. The legal system had been given 2 opportunities to reach a final decision, and both times the result was the same, no unanimous verdict. For Beckwith, the immediate consequence was that he was not convicted. For the Evers family, the consequence was far more personal. The man who had been identified by investigators after the murder was not going to prison for the killing. The evidence that had seemed to lead directly from the crime scene to Beckwith had not resulted in a final legal judgment. The distinction between knowing who authorities believed responsible and obtaining a conviction became painfully clear. This was not a case in which investigators had simply failed to find a suspect. Beckwith had been identified and arrested. The problem came afterward. The courtroom had failed to produce a unanimous verdict twice. The murder, therefore, entered a different kind of uncertainty. The physical crime scene was no longer active. The investigators had done their work. The rifle had been recovered. The fingerprint had been examined. The suspect had been identified. But the legal process had not completed its task. In the aftermath of the second trial, Beckwith returned to life outside prison. The case that had once been at the center of public attention began to recede with the passing of time. Yet the assassination itself did not disappear. Medgar Evers became increasingly remembered as a symbol of the civil rights movement. His work and his death became part of the larger history of the struggle against segregation. His name remained connected to the efforts he had made during his lifetime, registering voters, organizing boycotts, investigating racial violence, and advocating school integration. But alongside that legacy remained an unresolved legal question. The man arrested for his murder had never been convicted. For Merle Evers, the case could not simply become history. She had been the person who found her husband after the shooting. She had experienced the immediate consequences of the assassination within her own home. She had watched her children react to danger. She had seen Medgar taken away and learned that he had died. Now she had to live with the fact that the person accused of causing his death remained outside prison. Over the years, Merle continued to press for the case to be reconsidered. Her persistence would eventually become one of the most important forces in bringing the assassination back into the legal system. But in the years immediately following the failed trials, there was no final resolution. Time continued moving forward. The civil rights movement continued to change the United States. Medgar Evers' name became part of that history. Yet the murder remained a case without a conviction. The two trials of 1964 were especially significant because they demonstrated how difficult it could be to transform investigative evidence into justice in the historical circumstances surrounding the case. The evidence had not simply vanished. The rifle remained a critical part of the story. The fingerprint remained associated with Beckwith. The investigation had produced a chain of information that led to his arrest. But the verdicts had failed to follow the conclusions reached by investigators. The case therefore entered a period that would last for decades. There would be no immediate third trial. There would be no conviction in the 1960s. Beckwith would remain free. Myrlie Evers would continue her life without her husband while carrying the unresolved question of his murder, and Medgar's children would grow older without their father. The passage of time could have buried the case. Memories could have faded. Witnesses could have become unwilling or unable to speak. A murder committed in 1963 could have become another historical case whose legal outcome was never completed. But the story did not end with the second hung jury. The failure of the two trials did not erase the evidence. It did not erase the name of Byron de la Beckwith, and it did not erase the determination of those who believed that Medgar Evers' assassination deserved a final judgment. As the years passed, renewed attention would eventually return to the case. By the end of the 1980s, the investigation would begin moving again. New information would emerge, and witnesses who had previously been unwilling or unable to speak would become part of the effort to reopen the case. The legal system that had failed to reach a verdict twice in 1964 would eventually be asked to look at the murder again. The difference was that more than 2 decades had passed. The world around the case had changed. The people involved had aged. But the fundamental question remained exactly the same. Who was responsible for the murder of Medgar Evers? The first answer had come from the investigation in 1963, when a fingerprint on a rifle led authorities to Byron de la Beckwith. The courtroom had failed to confirm that answer in 1964, but the case was not forgotten. For Myrlie Evers, the absence of a conviction did not mean the absence of responsibility. It meant that the story was unfinished. And somewhere ahead, more than 20 years into the future, that unfinished story would return to the courtroom. After the second trial ended in 1964 without a unanimous verdict, the murder of Medgar Evers entered a period in which the legal process appeared to have reached its limit. Twice, Byron de la Beckwith had stood before a jury. Twice, the jury had been all white. Twice, the jurors had failed to reach a unanimous decision. There was no conviction. Beckwith remained free, while the Evers family continued to live with a loss that could not be measured by the conclusion of a courtroom proceeding. The investigation had produced a name, a weapon, a fingerprint, and a collection of evidence connecting Beckwith to the assassination. Yet none of that had resulted in a final judgment. For many cases, the passage of time can weaken the possibility of justice. Memories become less precise. People move away. Witnesses may become unwilling or unable to speak. A case can slowly disappear from public attention. The assassination of Medgar Evers, however, did not disappear. His name continued to be associated with the civil rights movement and with the struggle against racial discrimination in Mississippi. His work with the NAACP remained part of the historical record. He had devoted himself to voter registration, boycotts, investigations of racial violence, and efforts to integrate schools. His murder had taken his life, but it did not erase the significance of the work he had done. In the years after the failed trials, the difference between historical recognition and legal justice became increasingly clear. Medgar Evers was remembered, but Byron de la Beckwith had not been convicted of killing him. The man arrested shortly after the assassination remained outside prison. The case therefore carried an unresolved contradiction. The identity of the accused had been established early, yet the legal process had not produced the conclusion that the Evers family had been waiting for. At the center of that long period stood Myrlie Evers. She was not simply the widow of a famous civil rights leader. She was the woman who had heard the gunshot outside her home, gone outside, and found her husband seriously wounded. She had watched him being taken to the hospital, only to learn that he had died from his injuries. Her children had been inside the house during the attack. Their family life had been changed permanently in a matter of moments. The failure of the two 1964 trials could not change any of that. What it could change was whether the case would ever receive another opportunity in court. Myrlie did not accept the absence of a conviction as the final meaning of her husband's death. She continued working and remained determined that the case should be reconsidered. Her persistence became an essential part of the story because the passage of time did not cause the murder to become less important to her. Decades after the assassination, the legal case remained unresolved. But the memory of Medgar Evers remained alive. His death had already become part of the larger history of the American Civil Rights Movement. The struggle in which he had participated continued to shape the country. His name continued to represent a man who had challenged racial discrimination even while knowing that his work could place his life at risk. But remembrance alone was not enough for those seeking justice. The question remained whether the legal system could revisit a case that had already gone through 2 trials. Toward the end of the 1980s, that possibility began to emerge. The case received renewed attention. Information that had not previously been available to the courts became relevant. Witnesses who had previously been unwilling or unable to speak began to cooperate with the effort to reopen the investigation. This development was important because it meant that the case was no longer confined to the evidence presented in 1964. The old evidence remained part of the story, but the passage of time had also produced new information. The investigation could be reconsidered in a different historical environment. What had once appeared to be the end of the case could now become another beginning. One of the most significant elements of the renewed case involved statements attributed to Beckwith himself. New witnesses reported that he had boasted that he had killed Medgar Evers. Such statements were important because they offered another connection between Beckwith and the murder, separate from the physical evidence that had originally led investigators to him. The original investigation had centered heavily on the rifle and the fingerprint discovered on its scope. The renewed investigation now had additional testimony to consider. The case was becoming a combination of old evidence and new information preserved across decades. The passage of time had not erased every connection to the crime. Instead, it had produced circumstances in which people who had previously been unwilling or unable to speak were now prepared to contribute what they knew. The renewed attention eventually resulted in a new legal action. In December 1990, a new grand jury indicted Beckwith again. The man who had been arrested in June 1963 and twice tried in 1964 was once again facing prosecution for the murder of Medgar Evers. But there was another complication. Beckwith was no longer living in Mississippi. He had moved to Tennessee. Authorities therefore had to bring him back to Mississippi to face the renewed case. The distance between 1963 and 1990 was more than a measurement of years. It represented a transformation in the circumstances surrounding the prosecution. In 1963, Evers had been killed at the height of his work as a civil rights activist. In 1964, Beckwith had faced 2 trials and escaped conviction after both juries failed to reach unanimous verdicts. By 1990, the assassination had become part of American history, but the legal questions surrounding it had never been fully resolved. The new indictment reopened that question. It also demonstrated that the passage of time had not necessarily made the case impossible to pursue. The rifle and fingerprint evidence from the original investigation remained significant. The information concerning Beckwith's interest in the location of Evers's home remained relevant. Witness information concerning his vehicle in Jackson around the relevant period remained part of the investigative picture. His segregationist background and membership in the White Citizens Council remained connected to the possible motive considered by investigators. And now there were witnesses prepared to say that Beckwith had boasted about killing Evers. The case that had once appeared stalled was moving again. For Merle Evers, this renewed prosecution represented something that had been absent since the failed trials. Another opportunity for the justice system to examine the murder. But even then, a new indictment was not the same as a conviction. The legal system still had to confront the evidence in court. Beckwith would have to face another trial. And this time, the circumstances surrounding the jury would be different from those of 1964. More than a quarter of a century had passed since the first two trials. The man accused of killing Evers was now much older. The society in which the third trial would occur had also changed. Yet the central facts of the case remained rooted in the night of June 11th to 12th, 1963. A 37-year-old man had returned home from his NAACP work. He had stepped out of his vehicle carrying shirts marked "Jim Crow Must Go." A shooter had waited approximately 200 feet away. A rifle had been hidden among vines. A fingerprint on its scope had eventually led investigators to Byron DeLa Beckwith. He had been arrested on June 23, 1963. Then two trials had failed to produce a unanimous verdict. Now, after decades of waiting, the same case was moving toward a third trial. The story had survived because the people connected to it had refused to let the murder disappear. Merle Evers continued to press for reconsideration. The case received renewed attention. Witnesses became available. A new grand jury acted in 1990. Beckwith was brought back from Tennessee. The legal system was preparing to revisit the assassination. At this point, the most important question was no longer whether investigators had once suspected Beckwith. They had. It was no longer whether he had been arrested. He had. It was no longer whether he had faced trial. He had faced trial twice. The question was whether the third attempt would finally produce the verdict that the first two had failed to deliver. By 1990, the distance from the murder had become enormous. More than 27 years had passed since Medgar Evers was shot outside his home. Yet the case still revolved around the same fundamental issue: accountability for his death. The passage of time had changed the age of the accused, the composition of the society around the case, and the availability of witnesses. But it had not changed the fact that Medgar Evers had been killed at 37, leaving behind his wife and children. It had not changed the evidence recovered from the original crime scene. And it had not changed the determination of those who believed the murder should not remain without a conviction. The indictment of December 1990 therefore marked another turning point. The case was no longer merely a historical memory. It was once again an active legal matter. Byron DeLa Beckwith would have to return to Mississippi. The evidence would be examined again. The witnesses would speak again. And eventually, in 1994, the man who had twice escaped conviction would stand before a jury for a third time. The question that had remained unanswered for 31 years was finally approaching its moment of decision. By the time Byron DeLa Beckwith returned to Mississippi for a third trial, more than 3 decades had passed since Medgar Evers was shot outside his home. The murder had taken place in 1963. Beckwith had been arrested that same month. He had already faced 2 trials in 1964, and both had ended without a unanimous verdict. Now, in 1994, the case was finally moving toward another courtroom confrontation. Beckwith was around 70 years old. The passage of time had changed the appearance of the defendant, the society surrounding the case, and the perspective from which the evidence would be considered. But the essential question remained the same. Was Byron DeLa Beckwith responsible for the murder of Medgar Evers? The answer would have to come from a jury. The third trial could not erase the 2 failed trials of 1964, nor could it restore the life that had been taken, but it could finally determine whether the legal system would recognize responsibility for the assassination. The case arriving in court in 1994 was built upon evidence that stretched across 31 years. Some of the most important evidence had been collected almost immediately after the shooting. Investigators had reconstructed the trajectory of the bullet. They had followed the direction of the shot toward a location approximately 200 feet from the Evers home. There, they had discovered disturbed vegetation and a broken branch, suggesting that someone had occupied a concealed position. Among the vines, they found an Enfield .30-06 Model 1917 rifle. On the scope of that rifle was a fingerprint. That fingerprint had been sent to the FBI and compared with military fingerprint records. The comparison pointed to Byron DeLa Beckwith. The rifle and fingerprint had helped turn an unknown shooter into an identified suspect. The investigation had also produced other evidence. Beckwith was a white segregationist and a member of the White Citizens Council, an organization that supported maintaining racial segregation. His beliefs were directly opposed to the civil rights work carried out by Evers. Evers had served as the NAACP's field secretary in Mississippi and had worked on voter registration, boycotts, investigations of racial violence, and school integration. The conflict between those positions formed an important part of the background to the murder. Investigators had also found evidence that Beckwith had investigated the location of Evers's home before the assassination. Witness information placed his vehicle in Jackson around the relevant period, and there was an injury around Beckwith's eye that investigators considered consistent with the recoil of the rifle's scope striking the shooter. These details had existed in the case for decades. What had changed by 1994 was the legal environment in which they were being presented. The third prosecution also benefited from information that had emerged during the effort to reopen the case. Witnesses who had previously been unwilling or unable to speak became part of the renewed investigation. Some witnesses reported that Beckwith had boasted that he had killed Evers. Those statements provided another element for the prosecution to present. The case was therefore no longer limited to what investigators had gathered in the days after the assassination. It now contained the accumulated evidence of 3 decades. The original physical evidence remained important, while newer witness testimony offered additional connections to Beckwith. The third trial also carried the weight of what had happened in 1964. Twice, the legal system had brought Beckwith before a jury. Twice, the jury had been all white. Twice, the jurors had failed to reach a unanimous verdict. The result had been 2 hung juries rather than a conviction. By 1994, that history could not simply be ignored. It was part of the reason the third trial mattered so much. The prosecution was not beginning with an unknown suspect. It was returning to a case that had already been investigated, prosecuted twice, and left unresolved. The question was whether the evidence could now produce a different result. One of the most significant differences was the composition of the jury. In 1964, both juries had been all white. In 1994, the jury consisted of 8 black jurors and 4 white jurors. That difference carried enormous significance within the historical context of the case. Medgar Evers had been a black civil rights leader working against segregation in Mississippi. His assassination had taken place in a society deeply divided over racial equality. The 2 earlier trials had ended without conviction before all-white juries. Now, 31 years later, the case was being heard by a jury in which black jurors formed the majority. The evidence would be considered again, but this time the people responsible for reaching the verdict represented a very different cross-section of the community. The trial lasted approximately 2 weeks. During those proceedings, the central elements of the case were once again brought together. The murder itself had occurred outside the Evers home. The rifle had been recovered from a concealed position. The fingerprint had led investigators to Beckwith. His background as a segregationist and member of the White Citizens Council was part of the broader context. Evidence concerning his interest in the location of Evers's home connected him to the victim before the assassination. Witness information placed his vehicle in Jackson. His eye injury was consistent with the recoil of the rifle, and new witnesses reported that Beckwith had boasted about killing Evers. The case therefore rested upon a combination of physical evidence, investigative findings, and witness testimony. 31 years earlier, those elements had not produced a unanimous verdict. Now the jury had to consider them again. For Merle Evers, the third trial represented another stage in a journey that had begun on the night her husband was killed. She had heard the gunshot. She had found Medgar wounded outside their home. She had watched him being taken to the hospital, where he died from his injuries. Then she had lived through the two failed trials of 1964. For decades, she had continued pressing for the case to be reconsidered. The return of the case to court, therefore, had significance beyond the legal arguments. It was the result of years of persistence after a murder that had never received a final judicial conclusion. But the trial was still a trial. No matter how much time had passed or how important the case had become historically, the jury still had to decide whether the evidence established Beckwith's guilt. The courtroom had to reach a conclusion where the earlier proceedings had not. The question that had followed the case since 1963 remained sharply focused. Was Byron DeLaw Beckwith the man who fired the fatal shot? The prosecution presented a case that connected him to the murder through evidence that had survived. For 3 decades, the defense had the opportunity to challenge that case, as it had in the earlier trials. But unlike 1964, the third trial would not end in another hung jury. After approximately 2 weeks, the jury reached its decision. The verdict was guilty. Byron DeLaw Beckwith was convicted of the murder of Medgar Evers. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The courtroom had finally produced the result that the 2 earlier trials had failed to achieve. After 31 years, the legal system had reached a final judgment concerning the man who had been arrested shortly after the assassination. The conviction was a moment of accountability, but it could not undo the decades that had passed. It could not return Medgar Evers to his wife and children. It could not remove the memory of the gunshot or the image of a wounded man outside his own home. It could not erase the years during which Beckwith remained free after the 2 failed trials. What it could do was establish a legal conclusion that had been absent since 1963. The significance of the verdict, therefore, lies partly in its timing. 31 years had separated the assassination from the conviction. In many ways, the case had moved through 3 different eras. The first was the era of the murder itself, when Evers was actively challenging segregation in Mississippi. The second was the era of the failed trials, when Beckwith was twice brought before all-white juries and twice left without a conviction. The third was the era of the reopened case, when new witnesses, renewed attention, and a different jury finally produced a guilty verdict. The conviction did not make the previous decades disappear. Instead, it became the final chapter in a legal process that had refused to end after the first 2 trials. Beckwith had once been identified through a fingerprint on a rifle. He had been arrested within days. Yet it took more than 3 decades before the courts finally convicted him. That extraordinary delay became inseparable from the historical meaning of the case. The murder of Medgar Evers was no longer simply an assassination that had shocked Mississippi and the nation. It had become a test of whether a justice system could return to an old crime and confront it again, when earlier proceedings had failed. In 1994, the answer finally came. The jury found Byron DeLaw Beckwith guilty. The sentence was life imprisonment. For the Evers family, it was not a replacement for what had been lost. For the historical record, however, it marked the end of a 31-year legal struggle. Medgar Evers had been killed at 37 while returning home from the civil rights work to which he had dedicated himself. His killer had been identified almost immediately. But only in 1994 did the case finally reach the verdict that had eluded the courts in 1964. The story of the assassination could now move beyond the question of whether there would ever be justice. The verdict had answered that question. The remaining question was what that justice meant after so much time had passed. The guilty verdict in 1994 brought an extraordinary legal journey to its conclusion. But it did not bring Medgar Evers back. 31 years had passed since the night he was shot outside his home in Jackson, Mississippi. 31 years had passed since his wife, Merle Evers, heard the gunshot, and found him critically wounded. 31 years had passed since investigators recovered the rifle hidden among vines, discovered a fingerprint on its scope, and followed that fingerprint to Byron de la Beckwith. And 30 years had passed since 2 separate trials had failed to produce a unanimous verdict. The conviction of Beckwith was therefore more than the conclusion of a criminal prosecution. It was the culmination of a long struggle over whether an assassination that had occurred during one of the most difficult periods in American history would ultimately receive a final legal judgment. When the 3rd trial began in 1994, Beckwith was around 70 years old. The passage of time had transformed him from the 42-year-old defendant who had stood before 2 all-white juries in 1964 into an elderly man facing the same accusation decades later. But the central evidence in the case reached back to the night of the murder. Investigators had not forgotten the trail left at the scene. The bullet that struck Evers in the back had continued through the window, passed through a wall, struck the refrigerator, and finally came to rest on the kitchen counter. That trajectory had helped investigators determine the direction of the shot. Approximately 200 feet away, they found disturbed vegetation and a broken branch. Then they discovered the Enfield .30-06 Model 1917 rifle hidden among vines. On its scope was a fingerprint. That fingerprint had been submitted to the FBI and compared with military fingerprint records. The result pointed to Beckwith. The physical evidence had been there from the beginning. What changed was the ability of the legal system to bring all of that evidence together with information that became available decades later. The reopened case was not simply a repetition of 1964. New witnesses had come forward. Some were prepared to say that Beckwith had boasted that he had killed Medgar Evers. These statements added another layer to a case that already contained the rifle, the fingerprint, the evidence concerning Beckwith's interest in the location of Evers's home, information placing his vehicle in Jackson around the relevant period, and the injury around his eye that was consistent with the recoil of the rifle's scope. The prosecution, therefore, had an opportunity to present a much broader picture of the events than had been available during the original proceedings. The renewed prosecution had formally taken shape in December 1990, when a new grand jury indicted Beckwith. But Beckwith was no longer living in Mississippi. He was living in Tennessee, and authorities had to bring him back to Mississippi to face the charge again. The journey from the original arrest to the renewed indictment illustrated just how unusual the case had become. In 1963, investigators had moved quickly. By June 23rd, only days after the assassination, Beckwith had been arrested. In 1964, prosecutors had taken him to trial twice. Yet neither proceeding produced a conviction. Then came years in which the case remained unresolved. The name of Medgar Evers remained part of the history of the civil rights movement, while the man accused of killing him remained free. The persistence of Merle Evers became essential to the case's survival. She had lost her husband, but she did not allow the absence of a conviction to become the final answer. She continued pressing for the case to be reconsidered. Her determination helped keep attention focused on a murder that could otherwise have become another unresolved case from a violent period in American history. Her role is important because the 3rd trial did not happen simply because time passed. The case returned to court because people continued to insist that the assassination deserved another examination. When the 3rd trial finally took place, the composition of the jury was strikingly different from that of the 2 juries that had heard the case in 1964. The 1994 jury consisted of 8 African-American jurors and 4 white jurors. This was a significant change from the all-white juries of the earlier trials. The difference mattered within the historical context of the assassination. Evers had been a black civil rights leader working against segregation in Mississippi. The man accused of killing him was a white segregationist and a member of the White Citizens Council, an organization that supported maintaining racial segregation. The first 2 trials had taken place in the same state only a year after Evers's murder, under circumstances very different from those of 1994. By the time the third jury considered the evidence, more than 3 decades had passed. The jury was now composed primarily of African Americans. The case was being considered in a changed historical environment, but the underlying crime remained the same. The third trial lasted approximately 2 weeks. During that period, the evidence that had accumulated over the years was brought before the jury. The prosecution's case connected Beckwith to the murder through the physical evidence from the original crime scene and through witness testimony that had become available during the renewed investigation. The rifle remained central to the story because it had been found near the location indicated by the bullet's trajectory, and the fingerprint on its scope had been linked to Beckwith. The evidence concerning Beckwith's segregationist beliefs and his membership in the White Citizens Council provided the context for a possible motive. Evidence that he had investigated the location of Evers's home before the murder connected him to the victim's residence. Witnesses had placed his vehicle in Jackson around the relevant period. The injury around his eye was consistent with the recoil of the rifle's scope, and witnesses now testified that Beckwith had boasted about killing Evers. The evidence that had once failed to produce a unanimous verdict was being reconsidered by a different jury under different circumstances. The third trial was therefore not simply a question of revisiting an old crime. It was an examination of whether the evidence, viewed again after 31 years, could finally establish responsibility in court. For Merle Evers, the significance of the proceedings was deeply personal. She had spent decades living with the consequences of the assassination. Her husband had been killed outside their home while returning from his NAACP work. Their children had been inside when the shooting occurred. The family had experienced the violence directly, and then they had experienced another kind of uncertainty through the 2 failed trials. The absence of a conviction did not mean the absence of loss. It meant that the legal story of that loss had never reached a final conclusion. The third trial offered the possibility that it finally would. After approximately 2 weeks, the jury reached its decision. The verdict was guilty. Byron DeLa Beckwith was convicted of murdering Medgar Evers. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The moment was extraordinary because the same case that had failed to produce a verdict twice in 1964 had finally produced a conviction in 1994. The difference was not that the assassination had suddenly become more serious. It had always been serious, nor was it that the physical evidence had appeared for the first time. The rifle and fingerprint had been part of the case from the beginning. What had changed was the accumulation of additional testimony, the renewed investigation, the willingness of witnesses to speak, the passage of time, and the composition of the jury that finally heard the evidence. The conviction therefore represented a legal judgment that had taken 31 years to arrive. For the Evers family, however, justice could never be identical to restoration. A life sentence for Beckwith could not reverse the fatal shot. It could not restore the husband and father who had left home to carry out civil rights work and return to face a hidden gunman. It could not return Medgar to the 3 children who had been inside the house. It could not erase the decades that had passed without a conviction. But the verdict did establish something that had been missing since 1963, legal accountability. Beckwith, who had been identified by investigators shortly after the murder, was finally convicted by a jury. The contrast between the beginning and the end of the case was stark. In 1963, the investigation had moved quickly from the crime scene to the suspect. In 1964, the legal process stopped short of conviction. In 1994, the process was completed. The distance between those moments was measured not merely in years, but in lives changed by the assassination. Medgar Evers had become a historical symbol. Merle Evers had spent decades demanding that the case remain alive. Witnesses who had once been silent eventually spoke. Investigators returned to evidence that had survived for decades. And Beckwith, once again, faced a jury. This time, the result was different. The guilty verdict also became part of the broader historical meaning of the Evers assassination. His murder had taken place during a period when racial discrimination and violence were deeply Embedded in Mississippi, Evers had been working to challenge that system. His assassination demonstrated the dangers faced by people who demanded racial equality. His death shocked the country and became part of the pressure surrounding the civil rights struggle. The eventual conviction, more than 3 decades later, demonstrated something else: the possibility of revisiting an old case when the original legal process had failed to produce a final result. Beckwith's conviction did not change the historical fact that justice had been delayed for decades. Instead, the delay became one of the defining elements of the case. Medgar Evers was killed in 1963. Beckwith was convicted in 1994. 31 years separated those two dates. The man who had been arrested shortly after the assassination did not receive a final guilty verdict until he was around 70. That extraordinary timeline explains why the Evers case remains so significant. It was a murder in which investigators quickly identified a suspect, yet the legal system required more than 3 decades to produce a conviction. The story therefore ends not with the arrest, but with the persistence that followed it. It ends with a third trial, a jury of 8 African Americans and 4 white jurors, approximately 2 weeks of proceedings, and a guilty verdict. Byron DeLaw Beckwith was sentenced to life imprisonment. For Merle Evers, the verdict could not bring Medgar back. But after 31 years, the legal record finally acknowledged what the earlier trials had failed to establish. The case had reached its conclusion. Medgar Evers remained dead, but his murder was no longer without a conviction. And the story of the assassination became not only a story about a gunshot, a rifle, and a fingerprint, but also about how long justice can take when a case refuses to disappear. The conviction of Byron DeLaw Beckwith in 1994 finally brought a legal conclusion to the murder of Medgar Evers. But the verdict did not erase the years that had come before it. For 31 years, the assassination had existed in 2 different realities. In one, the historical reality, Medgar Evers had become a symbol of the civil rights movement, remembered for the work he had done to challenge racial discrimination in Mississippi. In the other, the legal reality, the man accused of killing him had remained unconvicted despite being identified and arrested shortly after the murder. The guilty verdict finally brought those 2 realities together. But to understand what the conviction meant, it is necessary to return to the life that had been taken and to the long period during which the case remained unresolved. Medgar Evers had not been a distant figure whose work was disconnected from the people around him. He had been a husband, a father, and a civil rights organizer whose professional life placed him directly in the struggle over segregation. As the NAACP field secretary in Mississippi, he worked on voter registration, organized boycotts, investigated racial violence, and supported efforts to integrate schools. Those activities made him an important figure in the movement, and also placed him in opposition to people who wanted racial segregation to remain. His family had received threats, and Evers understood that his work could put his life in danger. Yet he continued. On June 11, 1963, the national debate over civil rights reached another important moment when President John F. Kennedy delivered a televised speech on the subject. Evers spoke with his wife, Merle, and encouraged her to watch it. He could not stay home because his NAACP responsibilities required him to attend meetings and continue his work. Later, close to midnight, he returned to his home in Jackson. He was carrying shirts marked "Jim Crow Must Go." Those words represented the work to which he had dedicated himself. As he approached the house, a gunman waiting approximately 200 feet away fired. The bullet struck Evers in the back. He fell near his home. Merle heard the shot. Their children sought shelter inside, following what they had been taught to do when danger occurred. Merle went outside and found her husband gravely wounded. Neighbors arrived. Police were called. Evers was transported to the hospital with police escort, but the injuries were too severe. He died from blood loss and trauma. He was 37 years old. From that moment forward, the assassination became both a personal tragedy and a national symbol. The investigation itself was remarkably direct. Investigators reconstructed the bullet's path. After striking Evers, the bullet passed through a window, went through a wall, struck the refrigerator, and eventually came to rest on the kitchen counter. That trajectory pointed toward a firing position approximately 200 feet away. In the vegetation there, investigators found a broken branch and signs that the plants had been disturbed. They searched the area and discovered an Enfield .30-06 Model 1917 rifle hidden among vines. On the scope was a fingerprint. That fingerprint was sent to the FBI and compared with military records. The result identified Byron de la Beckwith. The suspect was not simply connected to the weapon. Investigators also found other information that strengthened their case. Beckwith was a white segregationist and a member of the White Citizens Council, an organization that supported maintaining racial segregation. There was evidence that he had investigated the location of Evers's home before the assassination. Witnesses placed his vehicle in Jackson around the relevant period. Investigators also noted an injury around his eye consistent with the recoil of the rifle's scope. On June 23, 1963, Beckwith was arrested. The speed of that arrest created an expectation that the case might move quickly toward justice. Instead, the courtroom became the place where the case stalled. In 1964, Beckwith was tried twice. Both juries were all white. Neither jury reached a unanimous verdict. Both proceedings ended with hung juries. Beckwith was not convicted. The contrast was difficult to ignore. Investigators had identified him through a fingerprint on the rifle. Additional evidence connected him to the victim and the circumstances of the shooting. Yet the prosecution did not obtain a conviction. Beckwith returned to life outside prison while Merle Evers continued life without her husband. The difference between the investigative conclusion and the legal conclusion would define the next 3 decades. The case could have disappeared into history, but Merle Evers did not allow it to disappear. She continued pressing for the murder to be reconsidered. Her persistence mattered because the passage of time can make unresolved cases increasingly difficult to reopen. The people who witnessed events may become unavailable. Memories can become harder to recover. Public attention can fade. But in the Evers case, the demand for accountability remained. By the end of the 1980s, renewed attention began to focus on the assassination. New information became available, and witnesses who had previously been unwilling or unable to speak began cooperating. Some witnesses reported that Beckwith had boasted that he had killed Medgar Evers. These statements added new testimony to the physical evidence that had existed since 1963. The combination eventually led to renewed legal action. In December 1990, a new grand jury indicted Beckwith. He was living in Tennessee at the time, so authorities had to bring him back to Mississippi. The case was once again active. But the passage of 27 years had changed the circumstances dramatically. The third trial would not be the trial of 1964. The defendant was now around 70 years old. The jury was different. The surrounding society was different. And the case now included testimony that had not been available during the original proceedings. In 1994, Beckwith stood trial for a third time. The jury consisted of 8 African Americans and 4 white jurors. The significance of that composition was considerable given the history of the case. The 2 earlier juries had been entirely white. Now, more than 3 decades after Evers's death, the majority of the jurors were African American. The trial lasted approximately 2 weeks. The evidence was presented again. The rifle remained part of the prosecution's case. So did the fingerprint that had linked Beckwith to the weapon. The investigation into Evers's home, the information placing Beckwith's vehicle in Jackson, and the injury around his eye remained relevant. New witnesses also testified about statements in which Beckwith had reportedly boasted about killing Evers. The jury was asked to consider the evidence and reach a decision where the earlier juries had failed to do so. This time, the result was different. The jury found Beckwith guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. After 31 years, The man who had been arrested shortly after the assassination was finally convicted. The verdict carried a significance that went beyond the defendant himself. It demonstrated that the passage of time had not erased the legal importance of the murder. It also demonstrated the extraordinary persistence of the Evers family, particularly Merle. She had refused to accept the two hung juries as the final chapter. Her determination helped keep the case alive until new evidence and renewed attention made another prosecution possible. Yet even the word justice must be understood carefully in this context. A conviction can establish legal accountability, but it cannot restore what a murder destroys. Nothing could return Medgar Evers to Merle. Nothing could return him to his children. Nothing could undo the fear and grief that entered their home on the night of June 11th to 12th, 1963. Nothing could recover the 31 years that passed between the assassination and the conviction. The verdict could only address one part of the loss: the absence of a legal judgment against the man responsible. That distinction is central to the meaning of the case. Justice arrived, but it arrived late. The delay itself became part of the history. Medgar Evers was killed at 37. His accused killer was identified within days and arrested on June 23, 1963. Two trials followed in 1964. Both failed to produce a unanimous verdict. More than 2 decades later, the case was reopened. A new grand jury indicted Beckwith in December 1990. 4 years later, a third trial finally produced a conviction. The timeline is extraordinary precisely because the investigation and the prosecution moved at such different speeds. Identification came quickly. Accountability took decades. The case also illustrates why the assassination cannot be separated from the civil rights movement. Evers's work had challenged racial discrimination at a time when that work could make him a target. He had spent his professional life encouraging black citizens to register to vote, organizing boycotts, investigating racial violence, and supporting school integration. His death, therefore, represented not only the loss of an individual, but an attack on the work he embodied. His assassination shocked the country and became part of the broader momentum behind the civil rights struggle. The eventual conviction added another chapter to that history. It showed that an unresolved crime from one period could be brought back into the courtroom under different circumstances. But perhaps the most enduring part of the story is the contrast between the simplicity of the evidence trail and the complexity of achieving justice. A rifle was hidden near the firing position. A fingerprint was left on its scope. That fingerprint led investigators to Beckwith. He was arrested 11 days after the assassination. Yet the legal system still required 31 years to reach a guilty verdict. The case therefore leaves behind a difficult question. What does justice mean when it arrives so long after the victim is gone? There is no simple answer. The conviction mattered. It established responsibility in the legal record. It acknowledged that the murder of Medgar Evers would not remain permanently unresolved. But justice delayed cannot become justice restored. The years cannot be returned. The family cannot be made whole again. What can remain is the historical record, Evers's work. His courage in continuing that work despite threats, the circumstances of his assassination, the evidence gathered by investigators, the 2 failed trials, Merle Evers's persistence, the reopening of the case, and the 1994 conviction. And even after that conviction, the story was not entirely over. Byron de la Beckwith still had years remaining in prison. His eventual death would bring the final chapter of his own life. But it would not close the historical significance of Medgar Evers. His name had already become larger than the circumstances of his death. He was remembered as a civil rights leader who worked to challenge segregation in Mississippi. The assassination had ended his life, but it had not ended the meaning of his work. The conviction of 1994 could finally answer the legal question that had remained open since 1963. The broader question: what is life and death revealed about America during the civil rights era, would remain part of the country's history. The story of Medgar Evers did not truly end with a guilty verdict in 1994. That verdict closed the criminal case against Byron de la Beckwith. But it could not close the history surrounding the assassination. Evers had been dead for 31 years by the time Beckwith was convicted. The man whose life had been taken in 1963 had already become a symbol of the struggle for civil rights long before the courtroom finally reached its conclusion. The conviction answered one question, but the larger meaning of Evers's life, his work, his murder, and the decades that followed remained. Medgar Wiley Evers was 37 years old when he was killed. His life had included military service during World War II and, afterward, increasingly important work with the NAACP. As the organization's field secretary in Mississippi, he became directly involved in the struggle against racial discrimination. He worked to register black voters, organized boycotts, investigated racial violence, and supported efforts to integrate schools. These activities placed him on the front lines of a movement challenging segregation. His work was not without consequences. His family received threats, and Evers understood that his activities could put his life in danger. Yet the possibility of violence did not cause him to abandon the work. That fact is essential to understanding the significance of his death. Evers was not killed while he was pursuing a private dispute or acting outside the work that had made him a public figure. He was killed after returning home from his NAACP activities. He stepped out of his vehicle carrying shirts bearing the words, "Jim Crow must go." The message represented the cause he had spent his life advancing. A shooter approximately 200 feet away waited near vegetation across from the house. The fatal shot struck Evers in the back. He fell near the entrance to his home, where his wife, Merle, and their children were waiting. The children sought shelter inside after hearing the gunshot. Merle went outside and found her husband severely wounded. Neighbors arrived. Police were called. Evers was taken to the hospital under police escort, but he died from blood loss and the effects of the wound. The violence was immediate, but the consequences extended for decades. The investigation that followed was notable because investigators were able to identify important evidence quickly. The bullet's trajectory provided a path. After passing through Evers, the bullet went through a window, passed through a wall, struck the refrigerator, and eventually stopped on the kitchen counter. Investigators used that trajectory to establish the direction from which the shot had come. Approximately 200 feet away, they found disturbed vegetation and a broken branch. Then they discovered an Enfield .30-06 Model 1917 rifle hidden among vines. The rifle contained one of the most important clues in the entire investigation: a fingerprint on its scope. That fingerprint was submitted to the FBI and compared with military fingerprint records. The result led to Byron de la Beckwith. Other evidence strengthened the investigation. Beckwith was a white segregationist and a member of the White Citizens Council, an organization that supported maintaining racial segregation. There was evidence that he had investigated the location of Evers's home before the murder. Witnesses placed his vehicle in Jackson around the relevant period. Investigators also noted an injury around his eye that was consistent with the recoil of the rifles. Scope striking the shooter. On June 23, 1963, Beckwith was arrested. From that point, however, the story became less about identifying the suspect and more about whether the justice system could convict him. In 1964, Beckwith was tried twice. Both juries were all white. Neither jury reached a unanimous verdict. Both trials ended in hung juries. The legal process therefore failed to produce a conviction even though Beckwith had been identified and arrested shortly after the assassination. He remained free. Medgar Evers did not. That contrast remained at the heart of the case for decades. Merle Evers refused to allow the murder to become simply an old historical file. She continued to press for the case to be reconsidered. Her persistence was essential to the eventual reopening of the prosecution. By the end of the 1980s, the case began receiving renewed attention. New information emerged, and witnesses who had previously been unwilling or unable to speak became part of the renewed investigation. Some witnesses reported that Beckwith had boasted that he had killed Medgar Evers. In December 1990, a new grand jury indicted Beckwith. He was living in Tennessee at the time, and authorities had to bring him back to Mississippi. The case that had been dormant for years was active again. In 1994, Beckwith faced his third trial. He was approximately 70 years old. The jury was dramatically different from those that had heard the case in 1964. 8 jurors were African American and 4 were white. The trial lasted approximately 2 weeks. Evidence from the original investigation remained important, including the rifle and the fingerprint on its scope. The prosecution also presented information that had emerged during the renewed investigation. The jury was now being asked to make a decision in a very different era from the one in which the first 2 trials had taken place. This time, the outcome was not another hung jury. The jury found Beckwith guilty of murdering Medgar Evers. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. After 31 years, the legal system had finally reached a definitive conclusion. But even then, the word conclusion must be used carefully. A conviction could establish accountability, but it could not restore the victim. It could not return Medgar to Murley. It could not give his children back the father who had been taken from them. It could not erase the years in which Beckwith remained free after the 2 failed trials. And it could not undo the circumstances that had made Evers's civil rights work so dangerous in the first place. The guilty verdict was therefore important not because it repaired the past, but because it acknowledged responsibility within the legal system. The case had begun with a murder outside a family home and ended with a conviction in a courtroom. 3 decades later, the distance between those 2 moments became one of the defining characteristics of the assassination. Medgar Evers died in 1963. Beckwith was convicted in 1994. 31 years separated the crime from the final verdict. Few details communicate the scale of that delay more clearly. Evers was 37 at the time of his death. Beckwith was around 70 when the 3rd trial took place. The 2 men belonged to entirely different stages of life when the case finally reached its conclusion. Yet the evidence connecting them to the events of that June night had survived. The rifle had survived. The fingerprint had survived. The investigative record had survived. And the memory of Evers had survived. The case also demonstrates how a murder can become inseparable from the historical period in which it occurs. Evers was working in Mississippi at a time when racial segregation remained deeply entrenched. His work challenged that system directly. His assassination shocked the country and became part of the broader movement for civil rights. The struggle continued after his death, and the national movement eventually contributed to major changes in American law. The National Park Service has regarded the assassination as one of the events that helped generate momentum toward the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Evers therefore became more than a victim remembered in a criminal case. His life became part of the story of a movement that demanded changes in American society. But the legacy of Evers should not be reduced only to the circumstances of his death. His significance came first from the life he lived and the work he performed. He worked to help Black citizens register to vote. He organized boycotts. He investigated racial violence. He supported school integration. He continued those efforts despite threats to himself and his family. His assassination ended his life, but it did not invalidate the purpose of that work. In fact, his death intensified the national awareness of the dangers faced by civil rights activists. The story also leaves a profound place for Myrlie Evers. She endured the loss of her husband and the experience of finding him mortally wounded outside their home. She lived through the 2 failed trials of 1964. She then spent decades insisting that the case deserved another opportunity. Her persistence helped carry the case from the unresolved past into the courtroom of 1994. Without that persistence, the legal story might have remained frozen in the era of the hung juries. Instead, the case was reopened, A new grand jury indicted Beckwith in 1990. Witnesses came forward, and a third trial finally produced a conviction. The later years of Beckwith's life also form part of the final chapter. After receiving a life sentence, he remained imprisoned in Mississippi. He died on January 21, 2001, after serving approximately 7 years of his life sentence. According to the historical account provided for this case, his death ended his personal story, but it did not end the significance of the assassination. By then, the legal record had already been established. Byron DeLa Beckwith had been convicted of the murder of Medgar Evers. The case no longer depended on speculation about whether the accused would ever face a final judgment. That judgment had come. Yet the most haunting element of the case remains the amount of time required to reach it. The investigation had identified Beckwith within days. The fingerprint on the rifle scope had provided a direct investigative lead. The arrest came on June 23, 1963. 2 trials followed in 1964. Neither produced a unanimous verdict. Then decades passed. Only in 1994 did a jury finally return a guilty verdict. That timeline forces a distinction between justice and restoration. Restoration was impossible. The life lost could not be recovered. The family could not return to the moment before the gunshot. The 31 years could not be given back. But accountability was still possible. The conviction demonstrated that an unresolved murder could be revisited and that a case could return to court even after decades had passed. The assassination of Medgar Evers remains powerful because it contains several stories at once. It is the story of a civil rights leader who understood the danger of his work and continued anyway. It is the story of a family whose home became the scene of a fatal attack. It is the story of an investigation that quickly uncovered a rifle and a fingerprint. It is the story of 2 trials that failed to reach a unanimous verdict. It is the story of a wife who refused to let the case disappear. And it is the story of a 3rd trial that finally produced a conviction. Above all, it is the story of a life that should be remembered for more than the manner in which it ended. Medgar Evers spent his life challenging a system of racial discrimination. He worked because he believed that Black Americans deserved the same political participation, educational opportunities, and protection from racial violence that should have been available to every American. He knew the work was dangerous. His family knew it too, but he continued. On the night of June 11 to 12, 1963, he came home from that work. A gunman was waiting. One shot ended his life. 31 years later, a courtroom finally answered for that murder. The verdict could not change the past, but it ensured that the legal history of Medgar Evers' assassination would not end with 2 hung juries. It would end with accountability. And that may be the most enduring lesson of the case. Sometimes justice arrives far later than it should, but the passage of time does not necessarily have to erase the truth of what happened. Medgar Evers' life, his work, his family, and his place in the civil rights movement remain part of American history. His murder became a symbol of the dangers of challenging injustice. His widow's persistence became a symbol of refusing to accept an unfinished case. And the 1994 conviction became the final legal acknowledgement that the assassination of Medgar Evers would not remain without judgment.